The ground was covered with but a few inches of snow. Stannis had moved his army to the west of the Dread Fort to face Roose Bolton and his relief army. Arrows flew through the sky, raining down on the field of battle. The iron tips of the arrowheads pricked and pierced shields and armor. The first stage of the battle had begun. Roose had aligned men into two battle lines, the first being his heavy cavalry, the second was his heavy infantry. On both flanks he attached a contingent of light infantrymen and horsemen. Sprawled just a few yards ahead of his formation, his longbowmen let loose their arrows onto Stannis' forces. As for Roose, he stayed near the second line on a small mound with his personal guard and Brienne of Tarth. 5 volleys had been sent out, and many arrows had met their mark, landing on Stannis' front lines. Dozens fell under the hail. Roose would turn his head to Brienne and speak. "The stag seems to wish to see his brothers. We should oblige him." With a signal from his hand, the large host of heavily armed cavalry began to muster. They started off slow, moving across the field. Popping his head out, Stannis showed himself to be near the front lines, his men having formed a shell with their shields above his head. Most of his army consisted of infantry, it seemed. They looked on at the oncoming horde. The horses under the commands of their riders began to gallop faster and faster as they grew closer. Brienne watched closely, and something seemed off to her. Looking at the field, she asked Roose a question. Where was his cavalry and archers? Roose scanned the field and knew something was off, but it was too late. The opening move had been cast and now needed to play out. Stannis smiled as he saw hundreds of cavalry and horsemen speeding right for him. He counted in his head as they had gone into full charge. Then, with a sudden urgency, he cried out, "Now!" Stannis' men suddenly drew out from the snow long pikes and halberds. The sudden spiked wall appearing caught the Bolton cavalry by complete surprise as they crashed into the spear wall. A few dozen were able to smash into the enemy, but many horses found themselves skewered and stabbed, as those in the back pushed those in the front into the spears. Yet this was not all Stannis had prepared. With the Bolton cavalry halting, most of the Baratheon men knelt down to reveal the center mass of Stannis' army had been his archers. Crossbow bolts and arrows let loose from just a few yards away, ramming into the Bolton host. Seeing his men stop in their tracks, Roose angrily cursed. As for Stannis, he armed himself with a Becta Corbin and hammered away at the plate armor of the enemy in front of him, using the hooked spike to tear men from their horses. Roose gave the command, and as flanking units began to march. He would win this day. He knew he would. Many of the Bolton heavy cavalry began to break en route, yet as they did once more, while in the heat of battle, arrows began to rain down upon Stannis and his men. Still fighting, they had no time or warning to cover themselves with their shields, and many of Stannis' men began to fall and die along with the Bolton cavalry. Corpses mounted as they piled into one another. One of Stannis' bannermen grabbed their king, pulling him from the hail as he covered him with his shield. Safe from the bombardment, Stannis examines the field, noticing the flanking forces. Brienne herself had rushed out over to the right flank to join in on one of the cavalry charges. Too many arrows fell upon the front lines for Stannis to prepare a proper defense line on the flanks. Brienne and her horses crashed into the right flank, smashing into the Baratheon lines, clearing the way for the light infantry to pile in. While the left flank was able to hold the lines and brace, the right flank turned into a mosh pit of blood and steel. Seeing the turning tide, Roose gave the rest of his men the command. His second battle line began marching forward with him and his bodyguard in the center. Stannis, losing grip on his Becta Corbin, drew his blade, cutting down 2 different Bolton men as if carving a cake. Seeing their king with them in the thick of battle brought great morale to Stannis' army. They had nearly slain all of the initial first wave, taking moderate casualties. Yet with the chaotic right flank, he worried. Taking a glance and seeing the left hold without much issue, the third phase of the battle was beginning. Stannis eyed Roose and his oncoming army. Nearly 1,500 heavily armed infantrymen marched forth. This would be the true test of Stannis and his men. He would look to the sky. Stannis wasn't much a man of faith, yet he had seen the power of the Red Lady, and with the reminder of Renly and the Peach, Stannis marched forward. His center forces, seeing their king, chanted, "To the king! To the king!" The remaining frontline force and his center reserves of his army archers charged, numbering around 700 men. The Bolton host may have been heavily armed with plates and chainmail, but Stannis, with most of his men, charged with hammers, pikes, short swords, and daggers, counters for the Bolton armor. Stannis himself would see a horse without a rider and mount it, As he led the charge, Brienne, still on her horse, would see Stannis across the battlefield, and with a blind sense of rage and duty, would ride out towards him. Roose, seeing the desperate charge, would draw his sword to signal his men to go into full charge to meet Stannis. It started with the flanks moving first as they wished to encircle him, yet something would catch Roose's ear, a blowing horn. He would look across the field, but not see where it came from, until he suddenly realized it came from behind. Then he heard it, a sentence, a chant. It started as what seemed to be a whisper, but then soon began to echo louder than any of the men dying. "The king in the north! The king in the north!" Hundreds of cavalrymen came rolling over from the hills, bannered with the sigil of a dire wolf. Grey Wind the wolf, companion of Robb, armored with leather and plates. Robb himself, sword in hand, next to him riding. Roose called his men to turn about, but it was too late. Robb Stark and his host of northern men crashed into the rear of Roose's army. Steel clanged against steel, fists smashed against flesh, hooves kicked against plates and bones. A dire wolf ripped limbs from bodies. Screams cried out as death became the loudest sound in the battlefield. Roose killed 3 men before looking at the mess in the field that was his army. They were surrounded and slaughtered. He had lost, so he needed to flee back to Winterfell. Calling out for his bodyguard to follow, Roose turned to suddenly see the sharp razor fangs of Grey Wind as the dire wolf leapt from the ground. Grey Wind ripped into his arms and shoulders, dragging him across the field as he cried out in agony and terror of the beast that had mauled him. His personal guard fled in fear, seeing their lord be ripped apart. Suddenly it was over, and Grey Wind let go of his prey. Roose, dazed, torn, and barely coherent, knelt, looking up at the pale horse in front of him. The words echoed in his mind. "The North remembers." Robb Stark on his horse began to trample Roose Bolton, stomping him to death under the heavy hooves. Robb then looked around for Stannis as the battle was coming to a close. Stannis cut down foe after foe. He then ducked his head as he saw the gleaming of steel flash in his face. Brienne narrowly missed her mark. The two stared off at one another. Stannis was more shocked at the sight of a giant woman in front of him, yet Brienne charged once more towards him. The two swung their swords at each other as they rode past one another, smacking their blades in each other's plated chests, sending them both from their mounts. They both quickly rose up to face off once more in their duel. Their swings and flourishing caused many around them to spread out, not wishing to be struck by a wild swing. Back and forth they went, evenly matched, slipping through the blood-soaked mud and snow. Brienne swung overhead, slamming down Stannis' blade, knocking it from his hand. She charged forth, attempting to end the fight, yet Stannis drew his dagger, dodging the swing and stabbing her hand, causing her to drop the blade. He followed with a knee to her face, knocking her back down. They both slowed greatly, with Stannis stopping to catch his breath, noticing at some point in the fight he had been cut in his leg. As he approached Brienne to finish the fight, he drew his dagger upward for the finishing blow, only for Brienne to spring back up, having found a spear on the ground, driving into Stannis' hip. As Stannis coughed blood, he was thrown onto his back by Brienne. She had done it. She had won. Brienne picked up her Valyrian steel sword, Oathkeeper, and walked over to Stannis, who lay on the ground staring up in the sky, his thoughts on his brother Renly. "I, Brienne of Tarth, charge you with the murder of Renly Baratheon and sentence you to death." Stannis merely looked up at her, unable to feel his legs. "Go on. Do your duty." As Brienne raised her blade, a strong sense of closure came over her. And then, nothing. She felt nothing. For her, the world suddenly went black into nothing, into a void. Stannis looked on, seeing the portion of Brienne's head fall in front of him, before the rest of her body fell afterwards. A rider had come and circled around Stannis. In his strained breaths, he finally got a clarity in his vision. Robb Stark had dismounted from his horse and stood next to him. The battle was won. The left flank had fully repelled the Bolton attack, and without Brienne, the right flank completely failed to break Stannis' men. Lastly, with the arrival of Robb and his forces, they routed Roose's army, killing them by the thousands. Robb attempted to help Stannis, but the king refused. He knew his time was coming. Shireen, Stannis spoke. "Protect Shireen." Robb nodded, agreeing he would. "Like she's your own." "I will. I give you my word." "Your brother." Robb thought he was now speaking of Rickon in the castle, until Stannis continued. "Snow. I sent him to take back Winterfell. Robb was shocked to hear the news of Jon. He looked down at Stannis, who lay still. He had now passed in Robb's arms. One of Stannis' men called out, "The king is dead!" before another cried out, "Long live the king!" Then as Robb stood up, all the men chanted, "Long live the king! The king in the north! The king in the north!" Jon, atop his horse, stared at Winterfell. A castle that he once called home was now some foreign place to him. "It's so massive," Ygritte spoke aloud, catching his attention, giving her a smile. "They're coming," Davos commented. Jon turned back towards the castle. Marching out from the gates was Ramsay Bolton and his army, or at least the main bulk of it, leaving a force of around 200 to man the castle defenses. Ramsay, knowing of his father and Stannis and how evenly matched they would be, he would not dare risk a siege if perhaps Stannis won the battle. For him, the smart thing would be to stamp out Jon Snow and his forces of wildlings now. "Perhaps they mean to parley," Tormund joked, seeing Ramsay and the host of lords riding ahead of the army. "Perhaps we can use this to our advantage. There may not be a need for a battle." "You'll think he'll accept a challenge?" Ed then inquired. "Only one way to find out," Jon commented. The group of 8 met in the middle of the field. The weather seemed to have favored the day for battle, as a little snow plotted the area, leaving mainly the dead grass and dirt. Jon frowned as he saw Ramsay's entourage. There was small Jon Umber, recognized by Jon for his armor, Alliser Thorne having been summoned south by Ramsay, and lastly a man he did not know, but wore the coat of arms of the Boltons. As for Jon, it was him, Davos, Tormund, and Ygritte. Ramsay looked past them to see around, some 3,000 wildlings standing in a mass. On each flank of them, Baratheon cavalry. The two groups spoke to one another, mainly insults being thrown, but then finally Jon offered Ramsay a chance to settle things in a one-on-one duel. Whichever side won, the other would surrender without question. Ramsay refused, noting that with help of the Night's Watch and the Northern Lords, his army doubled that of Jon's. They were armored and had all the advantages. Jon remarked on how well that control holds with the fear, as well as how willing they would die for him if he would not do the same. This angered Ramsay, but he kept his cool. They would fight this day and be done with it. Ramsay declared that no quarter was to be given for anyone on Jon's side. No prisoners, only steel. Jon huffed before turning his back on Ramsay, finally saying, "Remember, you were offered peace and turned it down." As Jon began to ride, Lord Umber spoke. "Lord Snow, the North remembers." This shook Jon as he watched Ramsay and his group ride back to their battle lines. "So what will it be?" Ed asked, seeing his friend return. Jon simply started one word: war. Ygritte nodded her head as Jon looked at her. She quickly rode off to the left of the army, with a number of others in the back of the line shifting as well. Jon then looked at Davos and Ed, who each began riding to a different contingent of cavalry. As for Jon, he and Tormund each took command of a bulk of mass they had mustered. Ramsay looked to his bannerman, Locke, giving him a nod. With the command, Locke rode out to lead his force of heavy cavalry. The plan was simple. Much like how Stannis had routed the wildlings beyond the wall, they would use their horses to rip right into their lines. Thorne would then lead part of the infantry to clean up the rest. As the cavalry marched, Jon and his forces moved up, forming a thick battle line ahead of Tormund's position. Ramsay would give a wave of his hand and arrows would fly, soaring high above and passing their cavalry as it landed down upon Jon's position, hoping to soften up he and his men. Men died by the dozens, but Jon still stand. The ground rumbled under the stampede of horses charging them, yet Jon did not waver. Seeing the force get closer, he finally noticed the passing a marker on the ground he secretly positioned. "Now!" he screamed, with one of his men blowing a horn. Hearing the horn blow, Ygritte, who had been at this point secretly repositioned herself adjacent to the battlefield with her force, gave a command. There's roughly 200 archers just over a hillside. They let loose their arrows, raining down on the unrelenting cavalry. They had begun raising their shields overhead to protect themselves. Even their speed had begun to decrease, yet they still charged onward, thanks to Locke's command. If they could reach John, then the arrows would stop. John, seeing them still coming, gave his hornblower another command. With the second blowing, many of John's forces broke forward from their positions, spears and javelins in hand. They chucked their weapons into the air, ripping apart the first few lines of horses. The ensuing chaos caused an uproar in Locke's forces. Horses panicked as they smashed into each other, and men flung from their steeds. John gave his third command, and with the third blowing of the horn, he and his forces charged forward, full tilt into Locke's men. Panicked, Locke would be able to get some form of counter-charge off against the wildlings, but it was still more than a stalemate. Ygritte, hearing the horns, halted her men from firing, for now they would have to listen. Horses cried out. Steel, iron, flesh, and blood made a symphony of death as the battlefield became littered and mounted with corpses. Angered, Ramsay would give the command to his archers. They began letting loose volley after volley into the mass. Seeing the cold-blooded nature of Ramsay, Davos drew his sword. John, in the thick of the fight, cut down 3 men, looking to see Locke riding right for him. Locke was attempting to end the battle now. Yet luck would not be on his side as John sidestepped his foe, cutting him down from his horse. Arrows fell all around. He used Locke's body as a shield to protect him, until finally the arrows stopped. John glanced to see Thorn now marching with the Bolton infantry towards them. Seeing his forces growing thin, John found his hornblower dead next to him. Without thinking, he picked up the horn and blew it. Tormund drew his sword. "Protect your lord!" he cried out, leading his force out to the battlefield. Davos and Ed also began to ride out to flank their forces. In the center, Thorn and his men charged in full tilt, as John and his men were relieved by a countercharge of Tormund and his reinforcements. With the two sides clashing, proper battle lines began to form, with the center being nothing more than a constant spray of blood. Ramsay watched as Ed and Davos with their horses began flaking into Thorn's lines. Ramsay looked into Small Umber. "Reinforce them. End this fight." "As you wish." Umber stepped out ahead of the force of 700 men. They began to march towards the battle. As they grew closer, their speed began to hasten. Ramsay began to grow a sinking feeling in his stomach as he watched on. Bolton banners began to drop from Lord Umber's men, and suddenly a host of others emerged from his force. There was the bear of House Mormont, the glove of House Glover, the trident of House Manderley, the white star of the Karstarks. Many more also sprouted up. Hornwood, Umber, Kerwin, Reed, and Dustin. It was an army of loyalists. Loyalists of Robb Stark. An army of Northerners. An army of the North. And the North remembers. Umber and his army smashed into the unsuspecting rear of Thorn and Ramsay's army. What was shifting into a formational battle suddenly shifted into a massacre, as all heard the chant, "The North remembers." "Shoot them!" Ramsay cried out for one of his commanders to inform him they had used their arrows. "Then send in the rest." With a horn blow and shout from the commander, Ramsay and the remainder of his army marched forth. If he didn't now, then they would surely lose the battle. One of his men then pointed to show him. Ramsay then looked out to see more banners as horses came riding over the hill. It was the sigil of House Aaron. The Vale had come. Ramsay paused, unsure of how to react, yet more anger and dread came over him, as riding past the Knights of the Vale, another host arrived. They are the banners of House Frey and Tully. Edmure himself rode up next to Lords Royce, Thoros, and the Hound. They each drew their swords, and with a shout they descended upon from the hills towards Ramsay. They began to split into 2 different triangle formations, one to reinforce and end the main battle, with the other made their way to Ramsay himself. Ramsay quickly began to ride back towards Winterfell, shouting at his men to retreat back to the castle. Over 1,000 attempted to run back to the castle, but with their backs turned and not braced into the formation, the Knights of the Vale ran down much of the lines of men. It was no more difficult for water to wash over the ground. Seeing the end of the battle draw near, Thorn attempted to make a cohesive retreat, but suddenly was met by Tormund, who without hesitation stabbed him in the belly with his sword. John looked on without little feeling towards Thorn's death, feeling only some relief in that some justice had been served. Taking his horn he had in hand, John gave one last blow. Across the field, Ygritte was giving her final command. She and her host came over the hills, and with them the mighty giant won. Ramsay dismounted, telling his men to prepare for a siege. They had lost the battle. Yet when the soldier questioned him, he attempted to reassure him that they still had Winterfell. They could hold out until aid came. But the words did little to ease the Bolton men, as loud bangs of pounding came from the main gate. Screams and steel echoed on the other side. Archers attempted to open fire, but Ramsay watched as his men were picked off by returning fire. Ramsay's eyes widened as the massive doors of the gate were ripped open. Dozens of wildlings and Northmen flooded in. Another skirmish had begun, but with an opening charge of veiled knights bursting in, the Bolton men were unable to form a solid line. Jon himself entered, carrying his sword Longclaw in one hand and a Karstark shield in the other. Lord Umber stood next to Jon, and the two gave one another a smile before small Umber turned to join the fray. Only, as he did, an arrow pierced his skull, dropping him dead. Jon turned to Ramsay, who was in the middle for preparing another arrow. Jon, enraged, lunged for Ramsay, shield raised, and he blocked 2 arrows. As Ramsay prepares a third shot, he is suddenly rocked back by a piercing arrow. Ygritte had come and seeing her man shot at, returned fire. Ramsay drops his bow, inspecting his chest, only for Jon to now be upon him. Jon knocks Ramsay down with his shield before standing above him. Without hesitation, Jon brings down his sword upon Ramsay's head. Seeing their lord killed, those left of the Bolton men surrendered. The battle was over, and they had won. Jon stepped outside the castle walls with Ygritte. They were followed closely by Tormund as they regrouped with Davos and Ed. Coming over to meet with them was Lords Royce, Edmure, Thoros, and the Hound. They exchanged thanks and greetings to one another as a rider arrived with a message. The Battle of Ice had been won, but Stannis Baratheon had fallen in battle. Davos was stricken the hardest with this message. When Jon asked who now ruled, the messenger responded, "The king in the north." Robb Stark now marches back to Winterfell. Hey guys, so yeah, that was parts 4 and 5 of the Robb Stark Lives fanfic. I'm actually really happy I finally got to do both the Battle of Ice and Battle of Bastards. I decided to make this just a really long video combining the two, as I felt like they both go hand in hand, as they both equally relatively happen around the same time, at least in my narrative. And that is Stannis' grand plan is to lure Ramsay Bolton or Roose Bolton, one of the two, out with a bulk of their force by attacking the Dreadfort and, luring them out, thinking that he's going to rescue Rickon. And so by drawing out their force, he then sends Jon Snow with the Wildling army, along with mainly his cavalry, to support and take out the smaller force that is at Winterfell. It just so happens that he was lucky to have Robb Stark come in and also help him in the fight. I did decide not to do the Hardhome and a lot of the White Walker plot lines, and that's mainly due to, from what I remember in the books, there isn't too much in terms of overt White Walker attacks as there are in the show, as the show makes it one of the biggest plot points, only to then squander it. So I decided for myself I would just avoid those and just focus mainly on Robb Stark and the Northern Civil War that's essentially happening. But yeah, I have one more part to finish up, kind of an epilogue of the whole thing, and that will wrap up the What If Robb Stark Survives the Wedding fanfiction series. Eventually, someday, I do plan on doing a sequel as it expands into the rest of Westeros and Daenerys' arrival and the whole thing with Cersei, and who knows, maybe I'll actually dive into the whole White Walker threat. But yeah, I appreciate you guys so much for following me and liking my videos and all around just enjoying the story. If you did like the video today and you like the story and where it's going, go ahead and subscribe, hit the bell notification, the generic YouTube phrases. And yeah, stay tuned for more. As in my previous update video, I have the other Rob Stark epilogue essentially done. I'm just doing some touch-ups, but that is scheduled to release next Friday. So, yeah. You guys have a good one today.